No worries. That's fine. We can give another minute if you want. You can give another minute if you want. I'm fine. I'm fine on time. So. Oh, there we go. Thanks. Great. Perfect. Amen. Thanks. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, everyone, for letting me come and share this evening. I'm going to talk, I want to give a history of some key cases that the U.S. Supreme Court has dealt with on issues of abortion laws in the country. This will be important because it provides a really good context for understanding the Kansas Supreme Court ruling of 2019, of which the Value Them Both amendment that you'll be voting on August 2nd, if you haven't already done early voting, is meant to overturn. Because there's been a lot of confusion about why do we even have the amendment to begin with. And so we have to understand, I think, properly what the amendment is trying to do in overturning this case and why this is so necessary, because one of the things I hope becomes clear tonight is that the Hodes and Nasser v. Schmidt ruling of the Kansas Supreme Court of 2019 is the most radical abortion ruling in U.S. history. Even more radical than the federal cases, which I'm going to unpack for you here briefly. And hopefully all of that will make sense. Once we've kind of moved through that, I want to talk just for a minute about what the amendment does and doesn't do, in addition to giving you some numbers. And these are numbers pulled, for those of you who may be watching, you're going to post this online, these are numbers pulled exactly from the Kansas Health and Environment research database. These are not some pro-life interest group or numbers that I've just manufactured out of whole cloth. These are numbers that the data that the state keeps, and then talk about some of the implications if it passes, talk about some of the implications if it doesn't pass. Does that sound good? Okay. All right. Stop me at any point in time if you have questions or need clarification. Going into some of these cases here is going to be just a little bit technical, so I'm happy to stop and fill in some details if you want it, but I think this will be instructive. So, yes, sir. Perfect. I'll do it. Perfect. Thanks. Appreciate that. Okay. All right. Let's start. So let's just consider these chapters in a story of modern American legal abortion rights, if you will. Let me just briefly go through this. This is Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965. This case was overturned a fairly long-standing law in the state of Connecticut prohibiting couples from obtaining birth control. And this law established, or this ruling established for the first time, a fundamental constitutional right to marital privacy. And it was done through combining the First, Third, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments to say that couples in particular have a right to privacy to obtain contraceptives. Okay, so this had nothing to do really with abortion, but it lays a groundwork, a legal groundwork for matters of privacy and autonomy that become important just 8 years later. Okay, so this Griswold v. Connecticut overturns a longstanding Connecticut law, so that way we establish a right to privacy for issues of birth control. Then we get to Roe v. Wade, 1973, the landmark decision in U.S. history for abortion, to establish abortion rights, 1973. There's a lot of things to say about Roe v. Wade. There are a lot of things to say about the build-up to Roe v. Wade, the aftermath of Roe v. Wade, how the decision was handed down. I mean, it's actually a fascinating story in its own right, and I would encourage you, if you have any interest, to read a book. It's a big 800-page book called The Family Roe, and it leads up, and it goes into the lives of Norma McCorvey, who was Jane Roe, and all of the, I mean, it's a fascinating history. It plays out just like any drama that you can imagine. She ended up not having an abortion, having her child. And so, but anyway, this established this case. What I want to point out that's very important, and that will be highlighted again in the Hodis case, are two things. One is the court in Roe found a right to bodily autonomy, meaning that a woman has a right to her own bodily autonomy, meaning that she can do with it whatever she wants, including ending a pregnancy. And they did this through the 14th Amendment. Through the 14th Amendment. What's a little bit ironic about that is the 14th Amendment was meant to codify the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was meant to protect newly freed slaves. And at the time of the ratification of the 14th Amendment, 36 or 37 states that did so all had laws prohibiting abortion. All of them. But yet, that same amendment is used here as to establish an absolute right to bodily privacy and autonomy for a woman to have an abortion. Furthermore, let me say this. The Civil Rights Act of 1866, if you go back and look at it, and you look at the legal reasoning behind it, it goes back to English common law, and the states that had laws prohibiting abortion all says that children in the womb are rights-bearing persons. All rights-bearing persons. The court ignores all of that, and through the amendment establishes bodily autonomy. Now, here's what Justice Blackmun did. He said that not only is it a fundamental right, but he applied what he called a strict scrutiny test. Now, strict scrutiny test had been around for a while from cases, actually commerce cases, going all the way back to the 1930s, I believe. And a strict scrutiny was the way in which the court decided what the government can do to pass legislation that would in any way prohibit or regulate a fundamental right. What's a fundamental right? Fundamental right is what we see in the Bill of Rights. A right to free speech, a right to come and worship freely as we wish, a right to assembly, a right to protect yourself, to bear arms, a right not to perjure yourself. These are rights found in nature. Some would say in nature's God. In nature, things that the government does not grant, things that the government protects that are given to human beings, okay? So a strict scrutiny says, well, the government can't prohibit a fundamental right, and any law that it tries to pass to do it will be, strict scrutiny will be applied to it, and it's almost insurmountable. You can't overcome it. So he did that for a woman's bodily right to autonomy in order to end a pregnancy. But, he said, he gave us a legal framework known as the trimester framework. We've all heard of trimesters, first, second, third trimester. This was an invention by the court to establish legal rationale to when and when it was not appropriate to regulate abortion. So Justice Blackmun said that bodily autonomy will be applied strict scrutiny any law against it, especially in the first trimester. However, going into the second trimester, the state may have what he calls a compelling interest to begin to regulate abortion practices. And the compelling interest only grows as the pregnancy grows in duration, to the point where the state, the federal government, or state governments can severely limit, if not prohibit, abortions up until the time of birth. Okay, so does that make sense? So he gives us strict scrutiny, but then provides a 3-trimester framework to think about how to apply strict scrutiny. So absolute strict scrutiny the first trimester, second trimester, somewhat strict scrutiny, third trimester, that eases off. You see how just completely arbitrary all of this is? Completely arbitrary. Not founded in any science at all. Philosophically, legally, he's just making stuff up, totally. And all the evidence behind the scenes points to the fact that he's just making all this stuff up. So this is what they give us. It has a sister case that's decided at the same time called Doe v. Bolton. Doe v. Bolton gives an additional layer to this that talks about health standards. So abortions cannot be regulated in the U.S., whether the federal government or the state government, anything that would in any way jeopardize the health of the mother. In no way can it jeopardize the health of the mother. And this will become very, very important as we see in later cases. So these twin cases establish the foundation or the framework, if you will, for abortion laws in the United States for the past almost 49 years. Okay? Let's fast forward here. 1992, we have Planned Parenthood v. Casey. Very important case. It's hearing the Roe v. Wade. It upholds the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade in that this is a right of a woman, but it changes some things. And Justice Souter, Justice O'Connor, and Justice Kennedy write the majority opinion, and they say, okay, we don't think that this is a strict scrutiny. This is not worthy of strict scrutiny. We're going to create a new test called the undue burden test. So no law can be passed by the state or federal governments that create an undue burden for a woman not to be able to exercise her right. And they did away with the trimester framework and just went to viability. 20 weeks, 21 weeks. Again, totally arbitrary, just shifting stuff around all over the place. Because there was a rationale. It actually softens this a little bit from Roe. Because what had happened between Roe and Casey is that states were passing informed consent laws. Other things that didn't necessarily regulate the practice of abortion, but were simply trying to help women really get the full information to know what they were doing. It was truly pro-choice in terms of being able to lay everything out. But because they were all happening in the first trimester, they were being struck down because strict scrutiny was being applied, and there was absolutely no regulation at all within the first trimester. So the court in Casey said, well, that's not placing an undue burden on a woman. It's just giving her the full breadth of information. Informed consent laws, women's right to know laws. Do you know what an abortion is? Do you know what's going to happen? Do you know what's going to happen to the baby? Do you know, of course I'm not going to call it baby, do you know what's going to happen to the fetus? Do you know what could potentially happen to you with your own health risks? Do you need 24 hours to go think about it? That's all this does. Those laws were being struck down before Casey, and they said, no, those don't create an undue burden, so that's fine. But they upheld the central ruling, and they upheld the thing in Doe v. Bolton with the health standard of the mother. But they scrapped the trimester framework, they gave an undue burden test, and gave viability. So anything before viability, as long as it doesn't create an undue burden, or if it creates an undue burden, is unconstitutional. Anything after viability, you can regulate it. But if you regulate it and it in any way jeopardizes or puts into question the health of the mother, it's unconstitutional. Well, what constitutes the health of a mother? Well, see, that was filled in by Doe. And it could have been psychological health, spiritual health, all of these things. Well, anybody can make a case that I'm being psychologically harmed by having to carry this baby to term. All right, well, you get an abortion. So it became, even though it somewhat softened Roe a little bit, it still was very complex because the health standard is so broad and can be packed and manipulated in so many ways that it was virtually impossible to find any good sticking laws that could in any way regulate abortion at any stage. The ones right up into the time of birth, partial birth abortion, those were easier to regulate, but we didn't do that here in Kansas. That was one of the reasons why George Tiller was able to enjoy such a long career here, because we were one of the few states that actually allowed it all the way up until the time of birth. Kansas was actually liberalizing its abortion laws before Roe v. Wade. Before Roe v. Wade. So we have a long history in this state dealing with abortion. Let me just pause there for a second. Any questions about what I've said? I'm just breezing through this. Any question? Let me pause. Make sense? Across the board. Depended on the state, depended on the law. Absolutely. 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 Okay. So then, just very quickly, we get this, it softens it a little bit. The United States Congress passes what they called the Partial Birth Abortion Act. So there was, I can't remember what it was, some type of OB conference or something like that, and some doctor there goes into this wild description of what a partial birth abortion entails. Graphic, horrific, barbaric. That gets picked up by the national media. The public is like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. So Congress passes the Partial Birth Abortion Act, signed into law. No, it wasn't signed into law it was not signed into law by Bill Clinton. I'm trying to think how they did it. Did they override his veto? I can't remember how they did. I think they overrode his veto. Anyway, it's challenged in court, and the Steinberg v. Carhart, they struck it down. They struck it down. This was meant to soften Roe, and Justice Kennedy, who helped write the majority opinion in Casey, what actually ended up being wanting to uphold the Partial Birth Abortion Act. He thought that he was striking a balance in Casey between this, trying to settle this issue once and for all to kind of placate both sides. He felt utterly betrayed by the majority in this opinion, and they struck it down. It goes back to the courts again in 2003 or 4. It's finally heard here. By this time, Justice O'Connor had retired. Justice Alito had been to the court, and they came back and they upheld it. They upheld the Partial Birth Abortion Act. Again, a lot of these things are being challenged not because of the viability or the undue burden, but because of the health standard. The partial birth abortion was like, it's the health of the mother. It's not broad enough to incorporate the health of the mother, therefore we're striking it down. Here's the other piece of this too, and this is part of the rationale in the Gonzalez case. At the time this case was argued, they had heard testimony from both pro-choice and pro-life OBs, both of which testified that they could not find one single instance where a partial birth abortion was ever necessary to save the life of the mother. Not one instance. And that was testified even on the pro-choice doctors. But yet they struck it down anyway. Here, they will go back and reference that. I think Justice Alito wrote the majority opinion, I think, and he goes back and references saying, we can't find any evidence that this would ever be medically necessary for a woman. Ever. So they uphold it. Then we get to Whole Women's Health v. Hellerstedt. This is recent, 2016. This was a law passed in Texas, and it wasn't regulating abortion, it was regulating the health and safety standards for abortion clinics. And what it did, it said in Texas, is that a doctor had to have privileges, not just at the abortion clinic, but at all of the nearby hospitals. And it laid down other safety standards. In the event that something went wrong in abortion, you have to be able to rush a woman off to the hospital. It was, again, for her health and safety. But what this would have done is taken the number of abortion clinics, which I think there were roughly 42 or 43 in the state of Texas, and because of the health and safety standards laws and the privileges that doctors had to have, and would have reduced it to 19. To 19. Well, it was going to be 5-4 decision. In the middle of writing the opinions, Justice Scalia died, so ended up being 5-3 with Alito, Thomas, and Roberts in the dissent, and they struck down this Texas law, saying it placed an undue burden on a woman. It was undue burden. She could not find an abortion clinic because it was moving it from 42 or 43 down to 19. Even though the 19 were in most of the major metropolitan areas, and the most a woman would have to drive is 100 miles. That's it. And that was an undue burden. So here's a kind of a brief history, very, very brief history, of major kind of landmark abortion decisions heard by the Kansas Supreme Court. Let me pause there for a second. Any questions? Yes, sir. No. These are all federal cases. Yep, that's Texas. These are all federal cases. So, these were part of Nebraska, Texas, so Pennsylvania, so just a handful of states that had laws limiting this that did this. All right, let's go to the Kansas case. Hodes and Nasser versus Schmidt, 2019. So in 2015, I believe, the Kansas legislature passes a very restrictive regulation ban on what they call D&Es, dismemberment and extraction. So this happens in second trimester. The baby is now too big to be suctioned out with a suction. So they dismember the child, most of the time alive, pull it out piece by piece. Kansas legislature put a ban on it, and it was challenged by an outside abortion group, and the Supreme Court hears the case in 2019. Here's why I think this case is the most radical in American history. The case is sprawling. It's huge. Between that and the concurring opinion and the dissents, well over 200 pages. There are 7 members of the Kansas Supreme Court. 6 of them were in the majority, only 1 dissent. Only 1. And what the Supreme Court did is they said that Section 1 of the Kansas Constitution, which says that there are natural rights for every person to have life, liberty, and to pursue happiness. They said included in this natural right is a fundamental right for persons to have absolute bodily autonomy, including a woman, to do with her body what she wants, and to pregnancy. Okay, so we're back into this territory here again. And they said this was a natural right. This is something that government does not grant. This is something government protects that has been from time immemorial, a natural right to do this. In a document, in an abolitionist document, mind you, adopted in 1859, guarantees a fundamental right to that. I mean, it's beyond all reason. Fundamental right. And what they do is they go back and they apply the strict scrutiny standard to all laws. So any law currently on the books that may be passed that would restrict or deny fundamental right to bodily autonomy is automatically presumed unconstitutional. Strict scrutiny. However, remember the trimester framework. So at least here in Roe, what Justice Blackmun did is gave the legislatures a legal framework to know how they could pass laws and when to regulate abortion. First trimester, nothing. But second trimester, yes, you could. Third trimester, even more. No such framework was given in the Hodes ruling. None. Just straight up strict scrutiny across the board. So what this does logically is it says that at no point in time does the Kansas State Legislature ever have a compelling interest to regulate bodily autonomy as it regards abortion. That's the way that it plays out, because they gave no framework. And in the concurring opinion by Justice Biles, who agreed with the conclusion but very much attacks the reasoning behind it, goes after the other people in the majority to say, why in the world would you give strict scrutiny and not give a framework to know if there were ever a time where the state could regulate it? And he says it explicitly, that this is going to put current laws on the books, including a Woman's Right to Know Act, informed consent laws, totally in jeopardy. because the state never has a compelling interest to do it. And on the bottom of page 72 of the ruling, it says, and all existing and future laws are presumed unconstitutional. Presumed unconstitutional. So they could have adopted the undue burden test, a little bit softer, done viability. They went straight to strict scrutiny, but they left out the framework. So this now becomes far more radical than anything that we've seen up here, and gives the legislature zero guidance. Actually, it does give them guidance. It just says, back off. This is not for you. This is not your realm. You have nothing here. So, and it's fascinating, just a little aside here, they go into this long kind of section in the middle talking about the nature of a natural right. And they pull from John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke on natural right and his issue on bodily autonomy. What's so interesting about it, it's ironic actually, is that when they're talking about this, it's from a section in Locke that talks about the nature of bodily autonomy, but also within the context of a family. It says explicitly that children are owed rights from their parents to be raised in safety, have their needs provided for, all of these things. But the court dismisses all of that. They're just giving these wild, haphazard history of natural right philosophy to kind of come up and bake this nasty tasting cake. I mean, it's just awful. So, this provides the context for understanding then why the amendment is so important. So as soon as this was handed down, so let me say one more thing about this case. This case obviously struck down that second trimester dismemberment and extraction law. Soon thereafter, a law that was regulating health and safety standards for abortion clinics. Many of you may have remembered the cases a handful of years ago of the abortion clinic up in the Kansas City area where there were bugs on the floor. Absolutely disgusting. Remember the old Hillary Clinton line, abortions need to be safe, legal, rare? Well, don't you think that if you're going to have a major medical procedure like an abortion that you would at least want to have it in a place that meets health and safety standards? I mean, the place was absolutely disgusting. And soon thereafter, because of this ruling, struck it down, unconstitutional. So there are two laws off the books, automatically. I have been in lots of online forums, debates, conversations with people who say, well, this case was, we don't need this amendment. All the laws are currently, being in effect. We can enforce their restrictions. It's 3 years ago. There have been no other cases brought. Well, first of all, you don't take into consideration we had 2 years of COVID. And second of all, that's not true. There's a new case that's been brought. It's making its way up through the Court of Appeals, filed over a year ago. That would change the laws on on abortion pills. So as of right now, in order to take an abortion pill, it has to be done in consultation with a doctor. You either have to go see a doctor or it has to be done with COVID over Zoom. It wants to change that to where all you have to do is do telemedicine. Make a telemedicine phone call in order to take an abortion pill. That's being challenged right now by the Trust Women Clinic and Foundation. So there are cases being challenged, and under this framework, if we don't pass the amendment, that's just going to be totally struck down. I mean, it has to be struck down based off of the framework that the Supreme Court gave us, which all the lower courts have to abide by. They're under a duty to do it. They can't override it. And I'll go into why that whole abortion pill thing is a mess to begin with if they actually get there changing it. So this provides a context for understanding what this thing does. And soon after this opinion was handed down, a group of people got together to begin to think about, okay, we need to now amend the Constitution. Hence the Value Them Both Amendment. And the Value Them Both Amendment, at its heart, just overturns this ruling. And it says that there is no fundamental right to an abortion or to absolute bodily autonomy is not a natural right codified in the Kansas Constitution. That's all it does. It returns us back to 2018. That's all it does. It turns us back to 2018 and allows the legislature, through us who elect them, to regulate abortion as they listen to the people of Kansas. to tighten abortion laws, restrict abortion laws, whatever. But the amendment itself just overturns this, says it's not a fundamental right in the Kansas Constitution. The only thing this amendment bans, that by them both bans, is taxpayer-funded abortion. It writes it into the state constitution that at no point in time will Kansas taxpayer dollars be used to fund and pay for abortions. That's the only thing it bans. Other than that, it just overturns this ruling and says abortion is not a fundamental right found in the Kansas Constitution. And then leaves the rest to the Kansas legislature and to we the people. And I've heard people say, well, it totally takes the court out. There will be no balance of power. No, it just goes back to 2018. It's no longer a fundamental right, but that doesn't mean that it can't be challenged in court. It doesn't mean that the courts can't even rule on it. It just means that at no point in time will it ever be considered a fundamental right. That's it. That's it. Whatever the legislature decides to do is the legislature's business in conjunction with the people who elected them to do it. And so there is absolutely no, first of all, there will be no ban on abortion in this state. I can guarantee you that right now. It won't happen. Politically, I don't foresee it happening. I don't think we'd ever have the votes. The most that could happen, could happen, is potentially a ban at 15 weeks. Potentially. But there are so many things that would have to happen, so many people and elections and things that would have to happen in order for that to actually be passed into law. So anybody who tries to scare or to distort, to say this is going to ban all abortions, they either they're just lying to you or they have no idea what they're talking about. The likelihood of that happening is very, very, very slim. But if it doesn't pass, then we have very good, very strong evidence to believe that all of the existing laws, at least the major laws, are going to be challenged in court. They're inevitably going to be struck down. And we, as Kansans, through our elected representatives, will have absolutely no recourse to change any of it. Unless and until we either pass an amendment or wait for the stars to somehow align to get enough people on the Kansas Supreme Court to somehow hear another case and overturn it like we did with Roe. But that could be 50 years, like with Roe. So this is our best shot to do that. And so I've also heard that there's a movement, I don't know how strong it is, of people who we might want to call kind of abolitionists, to say, you can't vote for this amendment because it's not an outright ban. Look, folks, politics is messy. Politics is messy. And this debate goes all the way back to the time before the Civil War. And you had the same kind of abolitionists that were putting all kinds of pressure on President Lincoln and everything else, saying, you're not going hard enough. You're not doing enough. It's time to end this immediately. And as much as he wanted to end it immediately, he said, then we'll never make any progress on any of this. The union will break apart. There's no way we can do it. We have to be able to take the steps that we're allowed at the right time with wisdom, with shrewdness, and move forward in that way. It's the same thing today. And a type of absolutist nature that would say this is unchristian to vote for this amendment and would vote no is going to be open season on every single abortion restriction that's in place. Will give us absolutely no recourse to change it at all. And as I'll speak to you here in a minute with some of the numbers, it will likely increase abortion tenfold in this state. And so any moral stand that says it doesn't go far enough, it's unchristian, but at the same time the result of that will be basically unfettered abortion in the state, there's a dissonance there. There's a clear dissonance there. We've got to get the amendment passed first, and then go to work to elect legislators who align with your view. That's the way the system works. That's the way the system works. So there's the case. That's what it does. Just overturns the HOTAS ruling to the Constitution and puts this back in the hands of the people and the legislators. That's all it does. It does not ban abortion. It just bans taxpayer funding. Let me give you some numbers here. Let me see here. Okay, so the D&E procedure, dismemberment and extraction, second trimester, since 2019 has increased 17% in Kansas. 2021, there were 478 dismemberment abortions in this state. And again, this is pulled right from the Kansas Department of Health and Environment. These are not numbers that I made up. Here's a number. In 2021, 49.8% of all abortions were from out of state. Half were from out of state. 2021. 300 abortions in 2021 were 17 weeks or after. I'm not a doctor, but my wife just had a baby 4 months ago. And every time we went in for a checkup, which the last month and a half, we were in there every week, there's a giant poster on the wall that pretty much shows from conception to birth every single stage of development along the way. And at 17 weeks, by just bald appearance, it looks every bit like a human being. No debate there at all. 300 of those. June 24th, right before we got the Dobbs decision, Kansas City Star ran an article, and they quoted the Guttmacher Institute. The Guttmacher Institute is a national abortion research group. So this is not some pro-life group. The Guttmacher Institute predicted that if Roe fell, this was right before Roe, if Roe fell, Kansas would see an increase of abortions by 1,000%. That's tenfold. There are roughly 7,000 abortions in Kansas every year. That's 70,000 abortions. Last year, half of them were from out of state. With Oklahoma, Texas, Missouri, all these others who have really restricted abortion, that number will grow exponentially. I actually think, honestly, 1,000 is a baseline. I work for a company that does benefit consulting for other companies. Since Roe was overturned, we've had numerous companies and internal discussions about clients, large clients, corporate clients, that now want to offer abortion services to their employees. Travel expenses, the whole thing. Companies will be paying for it. Kansas is not known as a destination for much. We're not much of a vacation spot. But we will become the destination for abortion tourism in this country. %1,000%. That's a huge number. It'll be bleeding Kansas all over again. All over again. And we'll have no recourse to change any of it. None. So that's why it's so important to pass this amendment. What about issues of the life of the mother? What about issues of ectopic pregnancies? Cancerous or septic uteruses? Those types of things. Any law that regulates abortion right now on the books makes exceptions for all of those things. Here, let me just say this. An ectopic pregnancy, a miscarriage, is not an abortion. That's not an abortion. Here's how this rhetoric is how it's twisted so much. We hear all this stuff about ectopic pregnancies and all this concern. If a woman takes the abortion pill and has an ectopic pregnancy, meaning that if it's outside of the uterus, oftentimes in the fallopian tubes, and she takes an abortion pill, her life is now immediately in danger. Immediately in danger. Yet it's being challenged to where she does not have to have any type of consultation with the doctor in order to do this. And yet everybody wants to talk about the health and safety of a woman and how concerned we are and all this stuff. Yet we're going to make it to where you can completely take this thing and you may have no idea that you have an ectopic pregnancy, and there you go. Your life is now huge in risk. Not only that, the abortion pills, especially when you don't have to have a doctor's consultation, does nothing but perpetuate and fuel more human sex trafficking. Because it's used by human sex traffickers for those pills for young girls to keep them in business. I no longer have to have any type of consultation or reporting with a doctor. I can just pick up a phone and do telemedicine, take the pill, move on, keep going. And yet this is supposed to be about the health and concern for women. I call BS on that. I do not think that that's true at all. What about race? The statistics are clear across the board, across the country, here in Kansas. African American women are more than 4 times likely to have an abortion than white women. Over 70% of all Planned Parenthood clinics across the country are placed in low-income, mostly Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. Go to the Planned Parenthood right on Central and Grove. In one of the poorest neighborhoods in Wichita, predominantly Black, Hispanic, and poor white. You want to talk about racial justice? I mean, it touches on every single one of these things. And those are the arguments you hear. We're going to be hindering poor Black women if we deny them their abortion. We never talk about how they're being unfairly targeted. We don't talk about the health risks, the overwhelming connection between abortion and breast cancer. We don't talk about the psychological harm. We don't talk about the fact that the men who are getting these women pregnant are completely off the hook for every bit of this. I want to be totally open here, and I've told people this in conversations, in debates I've had. I'm going to be on the KLC panel tomorrow. If we want to talk about laws with regulations, let's have a good conversation about how to pass laws that not only incentivize, but criminalize men who walk out on women who they've impregnated. So we should, as Christians, absolutely have concern and care for mother and child. And I know this is a church that values good manliness, and I have full faith and trust that your pastor and your elders would hold any man here accountable who's not living up to his duty to take care of his children. We need more of that. We need more of that. So this is what we're facing. And folks, I'm just going to be very blunt with you. Honestly, the likelihood of the amendment is close. And I've seen some polling that says it's not going to pass. That should not be a defeatist attitude. It means on your knees in prayer. It means vote, tell your friends to vote. So, hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. And for understanding why the I Them Both Amendment is so important, what it does, the context for all of this nationally. And we're a bellwether. We're the first state post-Dobbs to have any kind of legislation on abortion. And not only is it any kind of legislation, it's a statewide election. So it's not just through representatives, it's the whole state's able to vote on it. So, I mean, the whole nation's in this. And you can see all the outside dollars that are pouring in. Most of the outside dollars from the Vote No side. And to think that in some way they're not going to pour in here if it fails, with lawsuits, with all kinds of things. And I'll say this is just, this is Econ 101. Let's say it increases 1,000%. You have more demand, what do you need? More supply. We'll create an entire market industry for abortion here. You have more clinics, you have more doctors. It's open season, there's a lot of money to be made. The tax coffers will be full out of the blood of dead babies. Is that what we want in our state? So, look, I get it. And we should never, ever concede any ground on this issue about not caring for women. And I understand that there are women all over our churches who have had difficulties, who have had things happen to them, and have done things, and all this. And I'm not going to go into all this because that's what your pastor needs to do. And we need to love, and we all stand on equal ground at the foot of the cross, hands down. Hands down. But folks, we can hold justice for unborn life and for women and mercy and forgiveness for wrongs done. We can hold these things together. At the end of the day, isn't that what the cross itself does? Holds these things together. So, and the key, the key to valuing those lives is not more abortions. It's less. So, that's what I have. I'm happy to take questions, have a conversation, whatever you guys want. Yes, sir. Yeah, sorry. So the Dobbs ruling, so last year, Mississippi passed a law that was struck right at the heart of Roe v. Wade. And the Dobbs ruling, in a 6-3, the United States Supreme Court upheld that law and thus overturned Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton, which essentially just meant that abortion is not a fundamental right enshrined in the United States Constitution, and just sends it all back to the states to decide how they want to do it. So, and we get to decide. We get to decide. Had the Dobbs ruling not been handed down, I think this amendment would just pass. I don't think there would have been much about it. I mean, you would have had special interest groups coming in, but I don't think it would have been that big of a deal. But the timing of it after Dobbs, I mean, because we're the first state and all of this, I mean, and they see it as this is our chance to, I mean, this is a revenge vote, folks, for the pro-choice side. This is nationwide anger pent up after Dobbs, saying we're going to focus it all right here. Sorry, something back there, yeah. It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, and that's the other piece about this whole idea of, banning abortion that people want to level at the amendment. I mean, like I said, Kansas was liberalizing their abortion laws before Roe was ever even handed down. The whole nature of moderate Republicans, which this state has been full of them, that was all on this issue, all on the abortion issue. And so it's been its own internal fight in this state for a long time. And so we have our own kind of long story career. So, like, we're not Texas, we're not Oklahoma, we're not Missouri. We have our own history with this thing. And it'll be interesting to see, even in Texas and Oklahoma and Missouri, how long those laws stand as they are right now. Because they will have elections. And those people who pass those laws will have to face the electorate. Some of them will be voted back in resoundingly. Others may have challengers within their primaries or others because of this vote. The same thing would be true for Kansas. So, and that's part of representative democracy, folks. I mean, that's just the way it goes. I mean, that's you work and you do it. This completely denies representative democracy. So regardless, and that's what I've been telling people, regardless of whatever your position is on abortion, at the end of the day, as it concerns overturning this, if you're at all for representative democracy, you should vote yes on this amendment. But as the polling stands now, 10% of Democrats statewide are going to vote yes, 30% of Republicans are voting no. which seems pretty accurate given our history. Yeah, something else? Yes. Yeah. No, this legislature did, but I mean, they were behind it. Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. So here's the thing. I don't know the breakdown state by state, but most of the states that regulated or outlawed abortion before Roe didn't criminalize it for women. They criminalized the doctors. And so that's usually been the regulation has been on the doctors. And Justice Blackmun's rationale in Roe v. Wade, what he thought that he was doing was not so much giving women a right to an abortion as it was freeing up doctors to be medical experts. That was the way that it was kind of passed to him. So what he was doing was trying to overturn states that were criminalizing doctors doing what they thought were medically necessary. So I've not read or seen anything that they've said in terms of anything about criminalization, but the regulation side would be on the medical profession, not on the women themselves, most likely. I genuinely don't know. It would be up to the legislature. I've heard, I don't know, I've not seen with my own eyes, I've heard that there is a bill in the Kansas House that would potentially ban abortions at 15 weeks going forward. But that's the only thing I've heard. I don't know if that's even true. And then what's the likelihood of that even passing? I don't know. And let's just assume all that is true. It's all predicated on Governor Kelly not being our governor anymore. Which we have no idea if that's going to happen or not. I mean, I've seen some polls that say that she could win. I've seen other polls that said the race is too close. She just raised like $1.4 million this last quarter. Schmidt only raised $700,000. So I have no. That's what I'm saying. There's so many contingencies built into this. The people who are fear mongering, saying you pass the amendment and all of a sudden it's going to be. It's like, whatever my personal opinions are, which I think you can tell what my personal opinions are not even material to passing this because that's all now left to the legislative process, and anything can happen with that. So, talk to pro-life friends about those things, but if you're talking to people who are on the fence or like, I kind of agree with sensible regulations, but I don't want to ban it, being like, well, then you have no reason not to vote for the amendment. So, I think I've heard there's something in the House. I think that's what it is, a 15-week ban. I don't think it goes any more beyond that. And these bills start in a committee or with one or two legislators, and then they morph and they change, and by the time you get a vote, who knows what the thing could look like. So, but I can't foresee Kansas or any state at this point passing a law that would criminalize it with women. Everything would be on the regulation for doctors, which is pretty much how it was before that. You're exactly right. It's just called political viability. Politics is messy, and it's not very much is not consistent, but it's what can we get past? Which is why, folks, this is why you're here at this church. The kingdom of God is contingent on nothing. It's not, we're to be in the city. We're to seek the welfare of the city. But politics, government, all this stuff, these are what we call penultimate goods. These are things that we're involved in, things we care about. Because God cares about us and cares about his creation and God does not want chaos. God wants order. But these are not ultimate goods. These things not only will fade, they fade all the time. And the kingdom of God will never fade. And so whether this thing passes or doesn't pass, yeah, I care about it. Yeah, I'm fighting for it. Yeah, I'm praying for it. But the kingdom of God will be unshaken regardless of what happens with this. And the people of God should not be discouraged, but should live deeper into worship as warriors for the kingdom, pleading and intercessing for the lives who will be affected by this, and work even more diligently to take in mothers and their children and hold people accountable to the decisions that they make. So, sorry, that's a long answer, but yeah, it's political viability. What we can get past that approximates the justice that we want. Does that make sense? It's not ideal. I mean, it just never will be ideal. Yes, sir. That's a good question. I don't follow the state Supreme Court as much as I do the national Supreme Court, so I can't give you a perfect answer on this, but what's interesting is the gal who wrote this decision, the HOTUS decision, is retired. And the person who replaced her, even though as a Governor Kelly appointee, I think if that case was to be re-argued, I think it would be different. I don't think it would be overturned, but I do think it would be more of an undue burden than a strict scrutiny, and that would protect some laws that are in place. But in terms of getting the stars, I mean, I really have no idea. The only Brownback appointee is Caleb Stegall, and he's the only dissenting vote in the whole case. So, I mean, you'd have to have a succession, you'd have to have people retire, or whatever, and then you'd have to have an appointee and the process of what that looks like. And the way that Kansas does it is they're not fully nominated by the governor. They really receive from a pool from the Bar Association, and the governor pulls from them, and then they're voted on. There's not hearings or anything like that. So who knows? Who knows? Absolutely not. No, if this thing goes through, we're just back to 2018. The work continues, absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So no, it does carry weight. So right now we have the federal Hyde Amendment. So there's no taxpayer funding for federal taxpayer dollars. Massachusetts, the 9 other states that I mentioned earlier that had passed similar rulings, Massachusetts being one of them, others, that law regulating or stopping taxpayer funded was all challenged, struck down. Now Massachusetts taxpayer funded dollars does it. They have creative ways of doing it, but it could, I'm pretty sure it could happen through Medicaid. It could happen through other means. Medicaid might be a little tricky. Don't hold me to that, just because part of it is partially funded by the federal government, so I don't know how those dollars are allocated. So don't quote me on that, but those are all up for grabs. I'll just say that. I mean, if the law itself is struck down, they will find a way to make sure that it is funded, and using our dollars to do it. How, I don't know. So codifying it in the Kansas Constitution will be an absolute blanket. There will be absolutely no taxpayer funding of any sort whatsoever funneled down to make sure this happens. So, I mean, the other piece of it too is right now it's illegal for insurance companies operating in the state of Kansas to provide insurance dollars. That could be challenged too. Blue Cross Blue Shield. Just think about that. Blue Cross Blue Shield. Think about their symbol. Snake. Moses in the wilderness holding it up could now be, all of these symbols, all of these things, remember the 14th Amendment, all of these things are being completely turned on their head to support a secular sacrament of abortion. Who else? I thought I saw another hand. Yes, sir. Yep. Yep. In the state of Kansas. I don't know. I don't know. There could be reimbursement. There's a lot of different ways that employers can get that benefit, whether or not it's illegal. I mean, if the law regulating the abortion piece in Kansas is struck down, then it's safe to say that other insurance companies, but I don't know how the law's written, if it prohibits outside insurance groups from doing it or not, for reimbursing them. I don't know, so I don't want to say anything definitively on that. But if the law is struck down, so this is another thing to say. So you hear all the time people say, well, you know, there are already restrictions on the books. I mean, this is something you hear from the Vote No side all the time. That's correct. 2 of them have already been struck down, though. One's making it up through the Court of Appeals. We have every reason to believe that other restrictions are going to be challenged in court. And because, again, the nature of the HOTA's decision and how it's written, when they are challenged, they don't stand a chance. As the court said, they're presumed unconstitutional. And again, when they're struck down, the legislature, yeah, we have no recourse to do anything. They can't do anything. Yeah. If they're passed down and this doesn't pass. Yep. Most likely. Most likely it will be in a year or two, it will be another re-up for an amendment to go at it again. And, you know, they can put as many amendments. I mean, Kansas doesn't do this a whole lot. Missouri does this all the time. Missouri does statewide referendums, votes like this a lot. You have to have some kind of I think a statewide vote to even raise certain taxes in Missouri or something like that. Kansas does not do this very often, and it takes 3/4 of the Kansas legislature in order to get an amendment on the books. It took 2 times for them even to do it. Failed the first time, barely passed second. So, odds are they will, you know, they'll study this. They'll study the branding, the marketing, every bit of it, and it'll be a year or two. They'll re-up it and try to execute a different playbook. Sure. Sure. Absolutely. Likely not. No, because what would happen is and that's the reason those things are there, because then the court would say, well, you didn't make these proper exceptions, therefore the thing is, I mean, and they could challenge it in federal courts, everything would be struck down. So the amendment has been, a lot of legal people who do, legal experts who do this have done this for the language to make sure that this thing, if passed, is airtight. But again, just airtight meaning that it reverses the ruling. The rest of it's all up to the political process and whatever happens there. There are no guarantees. Nothing. Oh yeah, yeah. Unless or until the legislature can try to pass something that's more restrictive. Yeah, but everything that will happen, I mean, you better believe there's going to be outside money spent on it. Yeah. Yeah. Now, you know, over time they could lose interest. They could try to go somewhere else where they think they're going to have more of a chance to actually pass something. But I don't think that's going to happen for a while. So, but it's it's interesting. I mean, this will. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah. I mean, the fact that you've seen, I mean, I gave you the numbers earlier, the fact that we've seen abortions increase since the ruling gives you everything you need to know. And those are with a majority of the laws still in place, and we've seen an increase. If this doesn't pass, they'll only be galvanized. It'll only go up more. And then as they strike down more and more laws, more and more will be acceptable here in terms of not only practice, but medical regulation and all those things. I mean, we're talking about informed consent laws, folks. Women's right to know laws. This in no way, just as Casey said, this in no way places an undue burden on a woman not to exercise her so-called right. This is the truly pro-choice law. Do you know what's going to happen? Are you aware of the physical, mental, emotional consequences that this could take on you? Have you really counted the cost of this? Do you, take 24 hours, think about it before you do it? Unless you go in for like an appendectomy or you have, all of a sudden you have to have emergency bypass surgery. I can't think of any procedure really where you don't have some kind of delay. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'll take him and then I'll take you, Jim. They're pro-choice, and anything at all that would be conceived as a pro-life or I mean they've totally bought into this idea that it's going to ban abortion or do whatever. I mean that's their rationale. Yep. Yep. Well, the first thing there's a lot of things to say. I think the first thing to say is see how that plays out in any other regulation dealing. I mean, when people talk about don't regulate me or my body, it's like, well, look around and you and your body are being regulated all the time. You can't just go off and do whatever you want to do. And living in that kind of side would be bordering on anarchy. It would not be civil. It would not be ordered. I mean, I've got a libertarian streak that runs through me too. Trust me. But a world of a dog-eat-dog world where we just all can do whatever the heck we want to one another. And the basic libertarian proposition has been kind of a Hobbesian state of nature in which we come together to form government. So that way, the government's goal is making sure that we don't harm one another. That we can't just steal from one another. You can't just go off and hurt somebody or something like that. Otherwise, leave me alone. So let's just assume that basic framework is in place. Well, now it gets into, which is the question that underlines all of this. Who's a person? Who's a person? Who counts as a part of the human community? And, I mean, we don't need to go on this tonight, but I mean, there's every type of scientific, philosophical, theological, basic common sense argument that the fetus is a person. And the fetus, the baby, enjoyed rights of personhood, like I said, going back before in the English common law tradition, going all the way up through most of the American legal tradition before Roe v. Wade. And so the onus rests completely on them to talk about what's the thinnest we can go before we go into absolute anarchy, and to completely dismantle that the baby is not a person worthy of rights. So, but just to say, I'm a libertarian, I don't want any restrictions, that's not an argument. I don't even know what that is, actually, but that's definitely not an argument. And they don't live their life that way, nor would they ever want to. And at the end of the day, that's just what it is. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, they can give you whatever argument they want that apparently has nothing to do with abortion, but is just trying to protect freedom. But at the end of the day, it's just, I'm totally fine with unfettered abortion. And, which is fine as far as it goes. I just wish they'd be honest about it. And just say, oh no, you just want unfettered abortion. And they say, well, no, hold on just a minute. No, you hold on just a minute. That's what you're saying. Well, it's not. I want common sense restrictions. Okay, well, we have common sense restrictions now. Why don't you vote for it to keep them in place? Well, because I don't want the legislature to do X, Y, or Z. Okay, well then fine. Go work for candidates who won't do X, Y, or Z. That's called representative democracy. And last I checked, that's the system of government that's been handed down to us. If you don't want that system, then maybe you should look elsewhere. But that's the system we have. That's the system we operate within. And if you want to vote here and then go vote for Kelly or whatever pro-choice candidate you want, that's your prerogative. Go do it. But for people to say, well, I want common sense restrictions, but I'm going to vote no on that, that's a contradiction. Does that help? Does that make sense? Okay, there you go. Yep. That is a very long, complicated history that is worth reading about and investigating, that has to do with the underlying nature of kind of radical autonomy that has run through this country for a very, very long time. If you've heard of Alexis de Tocqueville, I mean, he wrote about this. He wrote about how Americans are a peculiar people because they are very, very quick to forsake social bonds, such as family, religion, other things, for a type of kind of unbridled freedom. And as much as he loved America and said all kinds of incredible things about the uniqueness of the American spirit, he warned Americans that this unchecked, unbuffered by bonds of local community, by churches, by families, civic guilds, those types of things, will lead to a form of radical autonomy that will be destructive. And that gets picked up in a lot of areas. It's flowing through all kinds of things in American thought. Then you have kind of radical strains of second and third wave feminism that pick up on this. A lot of the feminist movement is predicated on utter equality. Equality meaning that I should not have any type of prohibitions that a man does not have. So in order for women to compete equally with men in the marketplace, in advancements in career and all of these things, I need to be unshackled from pregnancy. That's the thing ultimately. My uterus is a form of slavery. And the more that I can release myself from that prohibition of pregnancy, the more that I'm on equal footing with a man. There's a wonderful book that's come out called The Rights of Women by a legal scholar and a historian named Erika Bacchioni. She's a very, very strong Roman Catholic gal scholar, and she talks about the original kind of first wave feminism of Mary Wollstonecraft, and the feminists who were fighting for women's right to vote, but were Susan B. Anthony and others who were staunchly against abortion, staunchly against it, but who fought for good women's rights for voting and other things and for equal dignity of women in the law, versus a kind of third or fourth wave feminism that is so radically unhitched from just biological realities, wants to tear down nuclear family, strains of neo-Marxism tied in with kind of a radical libertarianism, and all of these things. And she documents the history from going from what was a very movement that was actually in many ways grounded in a certain theological tradition to one that is a completely secular humanist and atheist, and how you get from one to the other. And abortion is a part of that story. It would be a worthwhile book to read. I think it'd answer a lot of your question. The Rights of Women by Erika Bacchioni. It's a Notre Dame Press. Anyone else? Look, I respect that, and I get it, and what they're fighting against is fighting for is completely abhorrent. But I do, it is wrong, 100%. I'm not going to deny it, but I do think you see throughout Old and New Testaments a type of realism operating within governmental structures, especially in the New Testament, where Israel is no longer a monarchy. They're living under the Roman imperial system and the cult, and not a syncretism of making compromises so much, but a way of living faithful in that system which they've been given, that is not calling for a revolution of overturning it, but a revolution of completely undermining it, in which the church lives a faithful life. And so, let me say this. Just because you can't go into a voting booth and outlaw abortion doesn't mean that you, in the community of the saints here, cannot lead and be a part of a revolution that undermines everything that stands for. And you can, and you've been given those means. And whether this amendment passes or doesn't pass, I would say you should live into those means. And don't make the penultimate, pulling a lever in a voting booth, the ultimate decision maker. Pray to bring the kingdom here. Bring the ultimate into the penultimate and let it revolutionize and do what it does. Because you could pull the lever today and that could be undone tomorrow. And that's just the nature of the political systems in which we live, which are radically imperfect, but they're what we have as a guard against complete moral degeneracy and anarchy. And then let the real revolution, the revolution of the church, do what it needs to, be a part of that and do what it needs to do. Does that make sense? I don't know. Kyle, do you want to speak into that? I don't want to usurp anything that you might say into that, but that's kind of that's my answer. Yep. You know, and I mean, here's just one idea. Gather a group, make it a part of your liturgy. That you have a prayer of confession, a prayer of lament, a prayer of intercession for babies and mothers in the state. That there will be more than you could ever do to go into a voting booth, which isn't an excuse not to go vote. Go vote yes. Go vote yes. But realize, if we got everything we wanted tomorrow, it's not an excuse to back off the pedal of living into the reality of the kingdom today and what that brings. Because all of that can be undone. And we're told that all of it will be undone in the last day. It will fade. And the true kingdom will come forward and we'll be able to see it. Is that helpful to you? I know the incrementalism sucks. It's not great. But that's just the reality in which we have. I really would, if you're interested in this, I would recommend going back. Let's just say this. Even if you don't want to read the books, just go back and watch the movie, the Daniel Day-Lewis movie, Lincoln. If you don't want to read any books, just go read it. It's a great movie. He's an incredible, probably one of the best actors ever. And it documents, I think, pretty fairly the tensions that were in place and the pressures that he felt from so many sides to do this, this, and this, to try to preserve the Union on one hand and end slavery on the other, and how absolutely, almost impossibly difficult it was to do that. And it's the analogies between, the connections between the fight against slavery in its moral dimensions and its political dimensions and all of these other dimensions, and the fight against abortion in its political dimensions and moral dimensions and all these things, they're radically similar. And the way that this debate is folding out in history is radically similar. And obviously, we're seeking first the kingdom of God. Obviously, we're going to Scripture first. Obviously, we're doing all this. But it is important, I think, to learn from history. And because the history of these things are playing out so much, and Kansas is at the center yet again. to see how he had, in order to navigate, to move forward with that. And how even after they got everything they wanted, the Union was preserved. We passed the 13th Amendment. We passed the 14th Amendment. But then what happens in Reconstruction? After the Northern Army pulled out of the South, the whole thing fell apart. And you just re-upped for another form of slavery and a form of Jim Crow. And it took, 100 years? So, a lesson there too. As soon as you get everything you want, there's just more work to do and more work to do. Which is why seeking the kingdom isn't a form of escapism, but ultimately resting on the promises of God that he will always do what he says he's going to do, and they will be complete, and they will be true, and they will be everlasting, and will never leave us wanting more. So, I'm not here to preach. So anyway, we're good? Awesome. Thank you.